Welcome to Boring Cinema. Tonight, we gently revisit the story of Forrest Gump. Settle in, relax, and let the film unfold slowly. A white feather drifts through a pale and cloudless sky above the city of Savannah, Georgia. It moves without hurry, rising and falling on small, invisible currents of air, spinning slowly as it goes. The feather is unremarkable in itself, soft and white, a little worn at the edges. But it moves through the frame with a kind of effortless grace that holds the attention completely. It rises higher on a warm updraft, then tilts and begins its slow descent, passing over rooftops and treetops and the quiet streets below. The feather eventually settles on the pavement beside a pair of worn shoes. The man wearing those shoes reaches down carefully and picks it up, turning it between his fingers for a moment. He opens the old paperback book on the seat beside him and places the feather between its pages with gentle deliberateness, as though it is something worth keeping. Then he closes the book, adjusts the box of chocolates resting on his lap, and looks out at the street in front of him with calm, patient eyes. His name is Forrest Gump. He is sitting on a bench at a bus stop in Savannah, dressed in a neat pressed suit, with his hands folded loosely over the candy box. He seems perfectly content to wait. A woman sits down beside him and glances at him briefly, and without any urgency or preamble, Forrest introduces himself. He offers her a chocolate from the box. She politely declines. He nods, unbothered, and settles back into his easy stillness. He tells her that his mama always said life was like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're gonna get. And then, as naturally as breathing, he begins to tell her his story. He has been waiting here a while, he explains. He has plenty of time. The words come out in the same unhurried, careful way he does everything. And the story he tells is longer and stranger and quieter than anyone sitting at that bus stop might expect. The bench itself is a modest thing, a slatted wooden seat painted a soft green, set beneath a large oak tree whose branches extend over the sidewalk and throw a gentle, dappled shade across the pavement. Savannah's streets have a particular quality in the middle of the day. The light is warm and slightly hazy, the kind of light that makes everything feel a little slower, a little more considered. Spanish moss hangs from the trees along the boulevard, stirring barely in the small movements of air. It is the kind of afternoon that seems designed for sitting still and listening. The story begins in Greenbow, Alabama in the early 1950s. Forrest grew up in a white two-story house set back from a long country road, surrounded by open fields and old trees. The house had a wide porch and a garden, and the rooms inside were filled with the small details of a life built steadily over years. The kitchen was always warm. The windows looked out onto the yard, where the light moved across the grass in long bands through the afternoon. There was a particular quality of quiet to the place that only country houses have. Not silence exactly, but the presence of natural sounds rather than mechanical ones. The wind in the trees, the creak of the porch boards, the distant sound of birds in the late afternoon. His mother ran the place herself, taking in boarders to keep the household going. She was a warm and resourceful woman who had strong opinions about nearly everything and shared them generously, particularly with her son, who listened to all of it with careful attention. She cooked in the mornings before the boarders were up and cleaned in the evenings after they retired, and somewhere in the middle of all this practical work, she found time to tell her son the things she believed were worth knowing. She told him about decency and about effort, and about the particular value of being kind to people, even when kindness cost something. Mrs. Gump was the kind of person who believed that ordinary words could carry the weight of serious philosophy if you chose them thoughtfully enough. She had a way of explaining the world to Forrest that cut through complexity and arrived at something true and simple and useful. She told him he was no different from anyone else. She told him that stupid is as stupid does. She told him that a person doesn't need to understand everything about life in order to live it well, that presence and effort and genuine care were sufficient tools for most of what the world would ask of him. These sayings settled into Forrest's mind the way seeds settle into soil, slowly and invisibly, becoming something that grew without his quite noticing. As a small child, Forrest wore metal leg braces that extended from his ankles up past his knees. The braces corrected a curvature in his spine that had developed in his early years. They were heavy and made a rhythmic mechanical sound when he walked, and they slowed him considerably. Running was barely possible, and even a quick walk required genuine effort. The world moved at a pace that his body could not always match, and he spent his earliest years navigating that gap between what he wanted to do and what his legs allowed. Other children could be unkind about the braces. Children at that age often don't know what to do with difference, and so they sometimes respond to it in the clumsiest possible ways, with staring, with whispers, with avoidance. Forrest absorbed all of it without obvious distress, in the same way he absorbed most things, steadily, without making too much of it. His mother had made sure he understood that other people's assessments of him were not definitions of him, and he seemed to carry that understanding in his body, even if he couldn't have articulated it in words. On his first day of school, Forrest climbed aboard the yellow bus slowly and looked around for somewhere to sit. Most of the children looked away as he moved down the aisle, or found reasons to turn their faces toward the window. He moved through the bus in that awkward silence until he reached the seat where a girl with long brown hair was sitting calmly, watching him approach without any of the usual hesitation. She said the seat beside her was free. Her name was Jenny Curran, and from that single simple offer of a seat on a school bus, the most important and enduring relationship of Forrest Gump's life began. Jenny was different from the other children in ways that were difficult to name directly. She was quiet, in a way that contained something rather than expressing nothing. She noticed things. She was not put off by Forrest's braces or by the particular way he spoke or moved through the world. She treated him with a directness and an ease that was entirely genuine. And he recognized this quality in her immediately and trusted it without reservation. They began walking home together in the afternoons, cutting through the fields behind the road, and those walks became the steady center of Forrest's early life. Jenny lived with her father on a farm not far from the Gump house. The farm looked pleasant from the outside. Old oak trees shading a worn farmhouse, fields stretching out behind it in the warm Alabama light. The red clay of the earth around the buildings held the heat of summer long into the evening, and in the mornings the dew collected in the grass until the sun burned it off. From any distance, it looked like the kind of farm that appears in photographs meant to represent something idyllic about rural American life. But what happened inside that house was not pleasant, and Jenny understood from an early age that the world contained places where it was better not to be. She had learned to find shelter in small places, in the fields when she could get away, in the fork of a high branch in one of the oak trees where she could sit and feel temporarily beyond reach. She prayed from those branches sometimes, eyes closed against the sky, asking to be turned into something that could fly away, Forrest knew that things were not right at Jenny's house without being able to fully understand what was wrong. He knew that she sometimes came to school looking tired in a particular way, and that she flinched at certain sounds, and that she preferred being outdoors to being inside. He knew that she walked quickly when she passed a certain stretch of road, and that her eyes sometimes went somewhere far away when she thought no one was watching. He didn't ask too many questions. He just stayed close to her and remained the one constant she could count on. And this constancy was the most useful thing he had to offer. It asked nothing in return. It was simply there, the way the sky was there, the way the fields were there in the morning when the light came through the trees. One afternoon, when Forrest was a few years older, a group of boys on bicycles spotted him walking along a dirt road and began shouting at him, then riding toward him with obvious intent to cause harm. This was not the first time something like this had happened, but today Jenny was nearby. She called out to him from the side of the road, telling him to run. He looked at the boys coming toward him, and then he ran. At first, the braces resisted him. They clanked and scraped against the road as he tried to push his legs faster than they were built to go. The boys on bicycles were gaining. But then something shifted. The force of his running, the urgency of the moment, the pure physical effort of it, something gave way. The braces began to crack. Bolts loosened. Metal pieces fell away piece by piece as he moved, and beneath the breaking hardware were legs that were, it turned out, perfectly capable of tremendous speed. He ran through a field and through a fence and through the middle of a football practice in full swing, players diving out of the way as this boy came barreling through without slowing down. The coaches stood at the edge of the field with their mouths open. The boy was fast. Startlingly, inexplicably fast. They made note of it. The braces were gone, left behind on the dirt road in pieces, and what remained was a young man whose relationship with his own body had been fundamentally and permanently revised. Those legs would carry him further than anyone in Greenbow could have anticipated. His speed attracted the attention of the University of Alabama's football program, and Forrest arrived at the university in the late 1950s with a small suitcase. No particular understanding of what college was supposed to mean, socially or politically, and an absolute willingness to do whatever the coaches asked of him. The campus was large and brick red and full of young people moving between buildings with a purposefulness that Forrest observed with interest, but did not try to fully absorb. He found the social landscape of university life somewhat complex, and he navigated it by doing what he always did, by being himself entirely and without modification, which meant that some people found him strange, and others found him entirely comfortable to be around. His job, as he understood it, was to run. When someone handed him the ball, he ran until they told him to stop. He didn't overthink the play or question the strategy or worry about what the defenders were doing. He ran with complete commitment in a single direction, and it worked with a consistency that his coaches found almost philosophically remarkable. He was a player who did one thing completely rather than several things adequately, and in certain positions, in certain game situations, that absolute completeness was more valuable than versatility. He became genuinely good enough to be invited to Washington as part of an All-American team, where he met President Kennedy in a brief and pleasant exchange. The White House was larger than he had expected, and quieter inside than the outside suggested it would be. The president shook his hand and made the kind of comment that presidents make to young athletes, something encouraging and well-phrased about the country's young men and the future. Forrest said, "Yes, sir," and "Thank you, sir," and was escorted to a reception where a great deal of food was available. He found the food excellent and focused on it with characteristic thoroughness. His time at the university passed in the way time passes when a person is occupied with work they are genuinely suited to, steadily, without dramatic incident, filled with the repetitive satisfactions of improving at something. He practiced, he played, he went to classes, and he listened to the world around him, changing in ways he was aware of without being fully immersed in. The early 1960s were a period of significant social change in Alabama and across the South, and the University of Alabama was not insulated from this. History was being made at close range, and Forrest was present for some of it in his characteristic way. There, without quite knowing what he was there for, witness to events whose significance he couldn't fully frame, but whose emotional register he could feel clearly enough. Meanwhile, Jenny had grown into a young woman who was finding her own way through a world that had not been entirely kind to her. She was at a small college, playing guitar in coffee houses, singing folk songs in a quiet voice to small, appreciative crowds gathered in rooms lit by candles and the amber glow of old-fashioned lamps. She had a gift for music that went beyond technical competence. She brought something genuinely felt to the songs she sang, a quality that other singers could hear and that audiences responded to even without being able to name what it was they were responding to. She sang about longing and distance and the desire for something better, and she meant all of it. She was searching for something she couldn't quite name, drawn toward beauty and freedom and the promise that life could be organized differently from the way she had experienced it growing up. She was drifting toward the cultural currents that were beginning to move through American life in the early 1960s. Civil rights, music, the gathering sense that change was possible and perhaps imminent. She read things and listened to people and went to gatherings where the ideas in the air were urgent and alive. And she found in all of this something that answered a need she had been carrying since childhood, the need to believe that the world was bigger and better than the particular corner of it she had been assigned. Forrest and Jenny stayed connected through these years in the way that some friendships do, not always present in the same place, but existing as a constant in each other's understanding of the world. They wrote letters. They visited when they could. The feeling between them remained steady and unambiguous on Forrest's side, and complicated and deep on Jenny's, though she expressed it differently and at different times. After finishing at Alabama, Forrest received a letter from the United States Army. The year was somewhere in the mid-1960s, and the draft was drawing young men from every corner of the country into a conflict that was still being understood and argued about in kitchens and living rooms and halls of Congress. Forrest reported for duty with the same straightforward compliance he brought to most things. He packed his bag and went where they told him. Basic training introduced him to a group of young men from very different backgrounds, all of them moving through the same demanding schedule of early mornings, physical exercise, and instruction. Most of the men were adjusting, some of them struggling, all of them figuring out the particular social economy of military life. Forrest adapted without difficulty. He did what he was told with reliable thoroughness, and the structure of the schedule suited him well. On the bus from the induction center, Forrest found another seat beside someone willing to share it. This time, it was a young man from Bayou La Batre, Louisiana, named Benjamin Buford Blue, who went by the name Bubba. Bubba was round-faced and soft-spoken, with the particular ease of someone who has grown up in a specific place and absorbed its rhythms completely. He knew the Gulf Coast, knew the water, knew the particular quality of early morning light over the bayou, and he knew shrimp. The shrimping knowledge came out almost immediately. Bubba began listing the ways shrimp could be prepared with the fluency and passion of someone reciting something he deeply loved. Shrimp cocktail, shrimp soup, shrimp stew, fried shrimp, broiled shrimp, shrimp on a skewer, shrimp in a salad, shrimp with grits, shrimp in every configuration the Gulf and human ingenuity could produce. He could go on for a long time, and he often did. Forrest listened to all of it without impatience. He found Bubba's certainty about shrimp genuinely calming, the way other people find certainty about anything calming. What Bubba really wanted was to have a shrimp boat. His family had worked the water for generations, and he had grown up understanding the business from the inside, the costs and the rhythms and the particular satisfaction of coming in from the Gulf with a full net. He had a plan, well considered and straightforward. He needed a boat and a partner, and he laid this out for Forrest over the course of the bus ride with the same detailed pleasure he brought to discussing shrimp preparation. Forrest said yes. He didn't need to think about it very long. Bubba seemed like someone who knew what he was talking about, and the arrangement seemed sensible and good. They were assigned to the same barracks and the same unit, and the friendship deepened through the weeks of training and then through the long transit towards Southeast Asia. They talked about the shrimp boat the way other men talked about their families or their hometowns. It was the future they were holding on to, the reason the present was worth enduring. Their commanding officer was Lieutenant Dan Taylor, a man whose bearing and manner communicated immediately that he took military service with great seriousness. His family had served in every major American war, and men in his family had died in most of them. This history was not merely a source of pride for Dan, but a framework through which he understood the meaning of his own life. He believed that he was meant to serve and that he was meant to die in service, and that these two facts gave his existence a shape and a direction. He ran his platoon with exactness and expected the men under him to meet his standards. He was fair in his way and capable, and the men respected him even when they found him difficult. Vietnam itself arrived in the senses before it could be understood intellectually. The heat was the first thing, a damp, pressing heat unlike anything most of the soldiers had encountered. The kind that settled into clothing and never quite left. The kind that made every physical effort cost more than it should. The air carried moisture constantly, not as a coolness, but as a thickness, a heaviness that the body had to learn to move through differently than it moved through the dry air of Alabama or Louisiana. The smell of the jungle was intense and green and complex, layered with decay and growth, and the particular dampness of heavy vegetation after rain. There was something alive about the smell in both senses. It spoke of abundance and of things ending, of the cycle running forward without pause. The sounds were unfamiliar. Insects in configurations that produced a continuous wall of noise, birds calling through the dense canopy above in voices that had no counterpart back home, the distant sounds of water moving over rocks somewhere through the trees. At night, the jungle was louder in some ways than during the day, the darkness filled with the calls and movements of things that the light had kept quiet. The men learned to sleep through some of this noise and to remain alert to other parts of it, to distinguish between the sound of rain approaching through the trees and other sounds that moved differently. They moved through this landscape on patrols that were sometimes quiet and sometimes not. The jungle swallowed information. You could be close to the enemy without knowing it, and the dense undergrowth offered concealment in every direction. The men learned to move carefully and to pay attention to details that their previous lives had never trained them to notice. They learned the difference between silence that was ordinary and silence that meant something was in it that shouldn't be. During these months, Forrest wrote letters to Jenny. He found the act of letter writing straightforward and calming. He described what was around him in careful, literal detail: the color of the sky before rain, the texture of the mud after it, the sound the jungle made at night when the insects settled into their fullest chorus. He wrote about Bubba and the shrimp boat plan. He wrote that he hoped she was well. He signed every letter the same way. He believed she would write back, and sometimes she did. And the letters she sent were brief and affectionate, and carried the particular quality of someone writing from a life that was moving quickly through many different phases. The ambush came without warning, on an afternoon that had been unremarkable up to that point. The platoon was moving through a dense section of forest when gunfire opened from multiple directions simultaneously. The noise was immediate and total. Men fell and scattered. Orders were shouted into a chaos that had no clean shape yet. Forrest did what he always did under direction. He ran. He ran through the trees with every bit of speed his body contained, away from the gunfire, the way he had been told to do. But then he stopped. He thought about Bubba. He turned around and ran back toward the sound. What followed was the part of the story that the film holds with great care, neither dramatizing excessively nor understating. Forrest went back into the jungle again and again, carrying wounded soldiers to safety on his back and over his shoulders, moving through smoke and noise and confusion with the same focused determination he brought to everything. He did not stop to calculate the risk. The risk was obvious, and he went in anyway, because the men in there were the men he knew, and he could not think of a reason that would hold up to leave them behind. He found Bubba sitting against a tree in a clearing. The wound was serious, and Bubba knew it, and so did Forrest, though neither of them said so directly. Bubba asked about the shrimp boat. He asked if they were still going to do it together, the two of them, after all this was over. Forrest said yes. He said they were still going to do it. And Bubba seemed to believe him, and he rested against Forrest's chest. And then he died quietly, in that clearing far from Louisiana, still holding the future in his mind like something intact. Lieutenant Dan was also pulled from the jungle, badly wounded, both legs lost. Forrest carried him out as he had carried the others. Dan survived, though the survival was not something he had wanted. He had been prepared to die, had believed in some deep and specific way that dying in service was the correct and expected conclusion of his story. Being saved felt to him like a disruption of something essential, as though someone had reached into the machinery of his life and removed a necessary part. He was furious about it in the hospital, furious at Forrest, furious at the war, furious at his own continuing heartbeat. Forrest spent some weeks recovering from his own minor wounds in a military hospital. The hospital was large and clean, and full of men at various stages of their recovery, many of them learning to navigate what their bodies had become after the things that had happened to them. Forrest watched television, received visitors, and one day noticed a ping-pong table in the recreational area. He sat down across from another patient and picked up a paddle. The game suited him in the same way that running had always suited him. It required presence without complexity, focus without analysis. He watched the ball and responded to it. The motion was repetitive and rhythmic and oddly soothing. He played for hours each day and became remarkably good with remarkable speed, his reflexes carrying him to a level of skill that was difficult to account for, except as evidence of the same quality that had made him so fast on a football field. His ping-pong talent attracted official attention. He was selected for an army team that traveled to China as part of a sports exchange in the early 1970s, a trip that was part of a broader diplomatic thaw between the two countries. Forrest played matches, shook hands, ate food he could not name, and observed China with the same open and unprejudiced attention he brought to everywhere else. He was present for something historically significant without understanding its historical significance, and this was, by this point in his life, something of a pattern. He was awarded the Medal of Honor in a ceremony in Washington. He was taken to the White House again and met a president who was interested in knowing about the wound Forrest had received in Vietnam. Forrest showed him in the direct and unself-conscious way he did most things, which seemed to both delight and slightly alarm the president. There was a photograph taken, and then Forrest was escorted toward the evening's reception. The anti-war rally on the National Mall drew an enormous crowd. Forrest had been invited to speak at it, brought on stage by an organizer who believed that a decorated veteran could carry a particular kind of weight in a gathering like this. There were people filling the area all the way back to the reflecting pool and beyond. Forrest looked out at all of them from the stage and began to speak into the microphone. But an army officer disconnected the amplifier before he finished, so only the people nearest to him heard whatever he said. What he said, he would describe later as something simple about Vietnam. He had been there. He reported what it was like. In the crowd that day, Jenny was standing near the water. She had been living through the late 1960s in ways that were intense and various, moving through protests and music festivals and communes, and the kinds of gatherings where people came together around shared beliefs about what was wrong with the country and what might replace it. She had been to Haight-Ashbury. She had followed bands and been swept up in the currents of thought and feeling that were genuine and searching, even when the specific choices they led her toward were not good for her. She had a gift for locating beauty in chaotic places and a corresponding vulnerability to the damage those places sometimes carried with them. When she spotted Forrest at the rally, she ran toward him through the shallow water of the reflecting pool without any hesitation. They came together in the middle of that great sheet of water with the crowd around them and the afternoon sky above, and they held each other for a long moment that neither of them tried to explain or qualify. It was the kind of reunion that says everything without any words being needed. That night they were together in Washington, and the tenderness between them was real and unhurried. Forrest told her he loved her the way he had always loved her, without condition or expectation. She told him she knew. By morning, she was gone. The currents that had been carrying her were still moving, and she went back to them because she had not yet found the shore. Forrest returned to Alabama, and the shape of his life reorganized around a new center. He thought about Bubba's dream of the shrimp boat and found that the thinking led naturally to doing. He had money from a ping-pong endorsement deal that had materialized in the way things sometimes materialized around Forrest, unexpectedly and without any particular effort on his part. He used it to buy a boat. He named the boat after Jenny because that seemed right, and because naming things after the people you love is one of the simplest and most honest things a person can do. He took the boat to Bayou La Batre, which Bubba had described often enough that Forrest felt he knew it a little. He was learning the business as he went, which meant learning it slowly. The technical knowledge required to run a shrimping operation was not inconsiderable. The equipment, the timing, the locations, the handling of the catch, and Forrest absorbed it all with the patient thoroughness he brought to any task he committed to. Lieutenant Dan appeared one afternoon on the docks in Bayou La Batre, having spent the intervening months since his discharge making his way through a period of bitter and largely solitary disintegration. He had drunk heavily and lived roughly, and moved from one city to another without settling anywhere, carrying his anger at the world and at himself, and at the simple fact of his survival. He arrived at the dock looking ragged but present, and Forrest welcomed him without commentary or judgment. Dan did not explain himself in any detail, and Forrest did not ask him to. He simply offered him a job on the boat. Dan accepted. He was not warm about it. He was sardonic and occasionally hostile, and made clear that he did not share Forrest's expectation that the shrimping would work. He had the manner of someone who has given up on things going well and found a kind of bitter peace in that expectation, and he wore it like a coat he had no intention of removing. He climbed aboard the Jenny with the careful deliberateness required to navigate the boat on his prosthetic legs and took up his position on deck. The early days on the water were discouraging. They went out each morning and came back with almost nothing. The nets came up with small, dispiriting catches, while other boats returned to the harbor with full loads. The water was there, and the shrimp were presumably somewhere in it, but they consistently found the parts where the shrimp were not. The other shrimpers were polite but clearly skeptical. Forrest maintained his routine with unbroken cheerfulness. Going through the motions of the work with the same full attention, he gave everything, apparently undisturbed by the results. Dan maintained his skepticism with equal consistency. They made an odd crew, but they were genuinely a crew. The days on the water had their own particular quality, separate from the disappointment of the small catches. There was the early morning departure when the harbor was quiet and the sky was still shifting from dark to pale. The engine's sound carrying across the water without competition. There was the particular light of the Gulf at different hours, the way the surface changed from gray to gold as the sun came up, the distant line of the shore growing smaller behind them. Pelicans moved in low formations above the water. The air smelled of salt and engine exhaust, and when the wind was right, the particular clean smell of open Gulf water far from shore. Then the hurricane came. It arrived from the Gulf with serious intent, a storm that was large enough to trouble even experienced sailors. The radio warnings were clear and specific, naming wind speeds and storm surges in coastal zones that needed to evacuate. Most boats came in and tied up, and the crews went to higher ground, securing whatever could be secured and leaving the rest to the weather. The harbor in the hours before the storm had the particular quiet of abandonment, the boats rocking in the increasing swell, the sky going a greenish gray that sailors know to read carefully. Forrest steered the Jenny out instead, reasoning that Bubba's mama had run a shrimping boat, and that you couldn't catch shrimp if you weren't on the water. Dan thought this was an absurd decision, but stayed aboard regardless, partly because he had nowhere else to be, and partly because some part of him that he would not have named was curious about what an actual hurricane felt like from the middle of it. He had challenged death before, or rather had invited it, and the storm was something like an invitation sent in the other direction. The storm, when it arrived in full, was enormous and loud and entirely without mercy. Waves came over the deck in solid walls of water. The boat pitched and heaved in ways that should not have been survivable, the hull twisting in the swells as the wind tore across the surface, and the rain came in horizontal sheets that reduced visibility to almost nothing. Everything that could be heard was the storm. The engine was there beneath it somewhere, struggling. The wood of the deck was slick, and the rails were the only thing between standing and the water. Forrest held on to whatever was solid, and kept the boat pointed as best he could into the waves. Dan went to the front of the boat during the worst of it and stood there with his arms spread and his face turned into the wind, screaming at the storm. He was screaming at everything. At the Army, and at Vietnam, and at his lost legs, and at the death that had been denied him, and at God, if God was listening, and at the concept of his own survival, which had always seemed to him like a mistake someone had made and never corrected. He screamed until his voice was gone, and the storm did not stop, and the boat did not sink. And eventually the long, violent night passed, and the water calmed and the sky began to lighten again at the edges. In the morning, the harbor was almost empty of undamaged boats. The storm had torn through most of what was there with an efficiency that left the docks looking hollowed out. Boats sunk or overturned or driven up onto the shore in positions that seemed impossible. But the Jenny was floating. She was battered and wet and exhausted looking, and she would need some work before she was in proper condition again, but she was floating. Without competition, the shrimping became extraordinary almost immediately. Their nets came up full day after day, loaded with shrimp in quantities that required additional help to process. The Gulf waters, stirred up by the storm, had driven shrimp toward the surface and toward the shallower areas where nets could reach them. Word spread. Business arrangements were made. The Bubba Gump Shrimp Company acquired more boats and more crew. Revenue grew in ways that would have seemed impossible to the two men sitting on that boat, watching empty nets come up from the Gulf a short time before. A man handling some of the company's financial affairs called Forrest one afternoon to tell him that they had placed a portion of the profits into a company that the man thought showed real promise. Forrest heard the word fruit company and assumed this meant they were in the produce business, which seemed reasonable enough. He didn't follow up on the details. Some time later, the same man called again and said, with a quality of restrained amazement in his voice, that the investment had done very well. The company was Apple Computer, and what had been invested as a modest holding had become something substantial enough to remove any financial concern from Forrest's life permanently. Forrest did not dramatically alter his way of living. He gave a large portion of the money to Bubba's family in Louisiana, which felt like the most obvious and necessary thing to do. He donated money to build a new church in Greenbow to replace one that had been in disrepair. He bought a lawnmower and began mowing the local football field on a regular basis, because he liked being outside and the field needed mowing and he had time. He was not, at any point in his life, particularly oriented toward accumulation. During this period, his mother became ill. He went home to care for her, and they spent time together in the way they had always spent time together, talking, sitting on the porch, watching the yard. She remained herself in all the ways that mattered. She told him she was not afraid. She had led a good life, she said, and she meant it. She had raised her son in the best way she knew how to raise him, and she believed she had done a reasonable job of it. She died quietly in the room she had slept in for decades, with Forrest beside her holding her hand. The house was still and the yard was full of light, and she let go of the world as peacefully as she had always inhabited it. Grief for Forrest expressed itself differently than it might for someone else. He didn't know quite how to be still with it, or where to put it. One morning, not long after the funeral, he put on his running shoes and walked out the front door. He ran down the road. He ran through Greenbow and out into the countryside beyond it, past the fields and the farms and the places he had known since childhood. He ran through the day and into the next one. He ran through the county and then through the state and then through the next state. And when he reached the Gulf Coast, he turned around and ran back. He crossed Alabama again and kept going north and east, and when he reached the Atlantic, he turned again. He ran until he reached the Pacific, and then he turned once more. He was running across America, back and forth, with no predetermined end and no particular direction except forward. The effort was enormous, and the rhythm of it was somehow sustaining. People began to notice. Someone took a photograph on a highway overpass, and the photograph spread through newspapers. A radio station in a small town mentioned it. A local paper sent a reporter out to catch up with him, and the reporter jogged alongside him for a while, and then filed a story that moved onto the wire services. The story had the quality that certain human interest stories carry. Something about it was hard to look away from, hard to summarize, impossible to make entirely sense of. And these qualities together produced a kind of fascination. Reporters tracked him down on the road and jogged alongside him with microphones, asking what he was doing and why and what he was trying to say. They wanted a purpose, a cause, a statement. They wanted him to be running for children with a particular illness, or for the veterans, or for environmental awareness, or for the rural economy. He told them he was just running. He didn't have a message. He wasn't running for any cause or any organization. He wasn't raising money or making a statement. Something inside him had needed to move, and so he had moved, and he was still moving because it still seemed like the right thing to do. The reporters found this unsatisfying but reported it anyway, and the story spread because people found something appealing in it. A man running for no reason, running just to run, covering the ground of the country one step at a time with no agenda and no end point in view. A small group of people began running with him. Some ran for a few miles out of curiosity, then peeled off and returned to their cars. Others stayed for days, matching his pace through desert and mountain and farmland. The group swelled and shrank at different points in the journey. Some of the followers wanted Forrest to tell them what it meant, to give the running a significance they could carry back into their own lives. He kept telling them he was just running. He ran through a muddy field, and without looking down, created in passing the phrase that would end up printed on a bumper sticker. He ran through the desert in sunglasses and a baseball cap, the dry heat very different from the wet heat of Alabama, the air here thin and bright and ruthlessly clear. He ran through the mountain passes where the temperature dropped significantly and the road wound back and forth across the elevation, the rocky peaks visible above the tree line for long stretches of the approach. He ran through the long flats of the Midwest where the horizon was so far away it seemed theoretical, where the sky was enormous above the wheat and corn, where the same straight road could carry a person for 100 miles without a significant turn. He ran past farms and towns and interstate exits and rivers and truck stops and drive-through restaurants. He ran through states he had never visited and through weather conditions he had never experienced. He ran through one night of driving rain in the Blue Ridge Mountains that came in sideways and made seeing ahead nearly impossible. He ran through a morning in the Nevada desert when the air was so still and the light so sharp that his shadow beside him was perfectly defined for miles in every direction. He saw the country from the level of its roads, at the pace of his own body, which was a pace that allowed detail. The particular construction of a fence, the condition of a barn's paintwork, the way a river bend caught the late afternoon light, to register without being processed into information. After 3 years, 2 months, 14 days, and 16 hours of running, he was somewhere in the middle of a long, flat stretch of road in the desert. The sun was directly overhead. The mountains were distant blue shapes on the horizon in both directions. The small group of current followers was behind him, their footsteps quiet on the warm asphalt. He stopped, just stopped in the middle of the road, as simply as that. He stood there for a moment, looking forward and then looking back. Then he turned around and told the people behind him that he was pretty tired. He thought he'd go home now. He thanked them for running with him. He turned around and walked away. The followers stood in the road and looked at each other. Someone asked what they should do now. It was a reasonable question, without a clear answer. Some of them stood there for a while. Some of them turned and walked in different directions. The desert held them all briefly in its enormous light, and then let them go. While Forrest had been crossing the country on foot, Jenny had been finding her way back toward something quieter. The years of searching had run their course, or most of them had, and the cost of those years was beginning to be felt in ways she couldn't ignore. She had settled in Savannah. She worked at a restaurant. She had a small apartment and a simple daily routine and a son. She wrote to Forrest. The letter said she was in Savannah, gave her address, said she would like to see him. He came immediately, with the same unhesitating directness he brought to everything that involved Jenny. He arranged the travel and went, without waiting to think it through or second-guess the impulse. He flew to Savannah and found her building on a quiet residential street, and climbed the stairs and knocked on the door with a steady hand. She let him in. She was older in the ways that years make a person older, and she looked well in the specific way of someone who has found a quieter mode of living after a period of difficult noise. She made coffee. She showed him around the small apartment with its cheerful clutter, and its afternoon light coming through windows that looked out onto the street below and the trees beyond. Books were stacked near the couch. Drawings made by a small hand were attached to the refrigerator door with colored magnets. There was the smell of something that had been baked earlier in the day, still faintly present in the warm air of the kitchen. She told him she had someone she wanted him to meet, and she opened the door to the room where a small boy was playing, and she said that the boy's name was Forrest, too. Forrest stood in the doorway looking at his son. The boy was bent over something on the floor, moving pieces of it with concentration, the focused stillness of a child absorbed in what his hands are doing. He had Jenny's watchfulness in the set of his face and a quality of alertness that was its own thing, neither his mother's nor his father's, but genuinely both. Forrest asked if the boy was smart. Jenny said yes, he was very smart. Forrest looked down at the floor for a moment, and then back up at the boy, and something shifted in him. Some deep internal configuration quietly and permanently rearranged itself, settling into a new shape that would hold for the rest of his life. He got down on one knee to look at the boy at his own level. The child looked up from his project and considered this new person in the doorway with the serious, evaluating gaze of a small person meeting someone significant. Forrest told the boy his name. He shook the boy's hand. He was, from that moment, entirely and unreservedly a father in every way he knew how to be. He asked Jenny to marry him in the kitchen of that small Savannah apartment, with the afternoon light coming through the window and the sounds of the street below drifting up through the glass. He said it plainly, without elaborate setup or performance. She looked at him for a moment in the way she had always been able to look at him, seeing him completely, without any of the barriers that most people put between themselves and one another. She said yes, with the same plainness, and the yes was real and complete, shaped by everything that had passed between them over 30 years. They were married in the yard of the old White House in Greenbow, under the oak trees, with a small gathering of people who mattered. The yard had been kept well. The grass was green and trimmed, the flower beds along the porch tended, the old trees standing as they had always stood with their wide canopies spreading shadow across the ground below. The afternoon was warm and clear. The house behind the ceremony was the same house Forrest had grown up in, its white siding clean, its windows reflecting the sky. Jenny wore something simple, and her hair was loose, and she was more beautiful standing in that yard than anything else in it. Lieutenant Dan came to the wedding. He had made changes in the years since the shrimping. He walked now on prosthetic legs made of titanium alloy, which he had told Forrest about with obvious quiet pride during a phone call some weeks before. He had found something in the time at sea that he had not been able to find on land. Not peace exactly, but acceptance. A willingness to be in the life he had rather than mourning the death he had expected. He had gotten engaged to a woman he seemed genuinely fond of. A woman who laughed readily and stood close to him, and didn't appear at all intimidated by whatever he might have been in the past. He stood at the wedding in the Alabama yard with the steadiness of someone who has put down a very heavy thing and begun to move more easily. He looked at Forrest across the yard with an expression that was not quite sentiment, but was something in that territory. The years in the White House in Greenbow were good years in the way that quiet years are good. Not full of event, but full of texture and warmth, and the small, daily substance of a life shared. Young Forrest grew and had opinions and asked questions, and was bright and lively, and his father watched all of it with the particular attentiveness of someone who had been waiting for this portion of life without knowing it was what he was waiting for. Jenny was ill. The illness had been growing in her for some time, seated in the years of her life that had been hardest and least kind to her body. The doctors examined her and ran tests and gave the illness a name, though it was one of those early 1980s illnesses, whose naming was itself still new and whose treatment was limited. She spent her time at home, and there were days when she felt well and the three of them did ordinary things together, and there were days when she rested while Forrest sat nearby and did whatever was useful or simply remained present, which was often the most useful thing. She died in the spring, on a morning when the light outside the window was soft and the air was still. She died in the bed in the house where they had built their small life together. Forrest sat with her until she was gone, and then he sat a little longer. He buried her under the tree in the yard. The tall old oak that she had loved as a girl, the one she had climbed when she needed to feel briefly beyond the reach of everything difficult, the one whose branches held the sky above Greenbow. He planted a small bench nearby so he could sit with her when he wanted to. He tended the yard around the tree with care, as though tending the space was a form of conversation. Young Forrest continued to grow. He was bright and social and comfortable in the world, and he had his father's steadiness and his mother's perceptiveness. Forrest drove him to school and picked him up in the afternoons and helped with homework and made dinner and did the ordinary things that constitute a father's daily life. All of it without complaint and with a genuine and evident pleasure that many people observed without being able to fully explain. On the morning the story comes full circle. Forrest is at the bus stop in Savannah. He is taking the bus to young Forrest's school today. He is dressed in his good suit with the box of chocolates on his lap, and he has been telling his story to whoever happens to sit down beside him on the bench, as though the story wants to be told, and he is simply the one who has it to tell. Each person who has sat beside him on that bench has received a portion of the story, however much time their wait allowed. Some stayed through long sections, and others only heard a few paragraphs before their own bus arrived, but each of them left carrying something, even if they weren't sure exactly what. Forrest doesn't seem to be performing the telling. He isn't speaking loudly or gesturing dramatically. The story comes out in the same quiet, steady way he does everything, present, unhurried, genuine. The people who sit beside him seem to feel this quality and respond to it, settling into the bench with a slight loosening of whatever tension they arrived with. There is something about a person who is entirely at ease with themselves that communicates itself without words, that makes the air around them a little easier to be in. The bus arrives with the particular sound that buses make. The pneumatic sigh of the doors opening, the idle of the engine, the mechanical steps unfolding toward the pavement. Forrest thanks whoever has been listening. He folds the book with the feather inside it under his arm, picks up the chocolates and climbs aboard. He finds a seat near the window and settles into it with the comfortable ease of someone who does not make transitions difficult. He watches Savannah pass by, outside the glass. The old squares with their fountains and their benches and their enormous trees, the streets of pale brick and wrought iron, the light filtering through the canopy overhead in the particular golden way it does in the late afternoon in Georgia. He rides through the city's streets in that same contented, unhurried way he has always moved through the world, not particularly concerned about what comes next, because what comes next will come regardless. And his job, as he has always understood it, is simply to be present when it arrives. He waits outside the school as the afternoon empties out the doors. Students stream past in the organized chaos of end-of-day release, backpacks swinging, conversations overlapping, the particular energy of children released from sitting still. Young Forrest comes out with his backpack, moving through the crowd of other students with an ease that makes it clear he is a child who knows where he belongs and is comfortable there. He has his father's steadiness and something of his mother's brightness, and he carries these things together without any apparent awareness of how remarkable the combination is. He spots his father waiting, and his expression does what children's expressions do when they see the person they trust most. It opens, relaxes, arrives, becomes entirely itself. They get into the car. The afternoon continues in whatever ordinary and irreplaceable way it will. The white feather appears once more, lifting from the pavement of the Savannah Street on a gentle current of warm air rising from the sun-warmed sidewalk. It rises above the city, above the Spanish moss and the magnolia leaves and the old brick walls, above the river's slow green water reflecting the sky. It drifts and turns in the high air, held up by nothing visible, going wherever the wind decides to carry it. And the story releases it into the sky with the same light ease with which everything in this film ultimately releases. Into air, into distance, into the blue and continuing afternoon. Now that the story is gently unfolded, it can be interesting to reflect on some of the ideas behind the film. Forrest Gump was directed by Robert Zemeckis and released in the summer of 1994. The screenplay was written by Eric Roth, adapted from a novel by Winston Groom, though the film took the source material in considerably different directions, softening some of its edges and adding a reflective quality that the novel's more satirical tone didn't quite contain. The result was a film that moved enormous numbers of people without always being able to say precisely why, which is itself evidence of something working at a level below conscious analysis. The film's most persistent and foundational theme is the relationship between intention and outcome, between what a person plans and what actually happens to them. Forrest is a character who does not plan in any conventional sense. He does not have a 5-year vision or a strategic understanding of his own life. He has values, loyalty, presence, effort, love, and he applies them to whatever situation is in front of him. What this produces, over the course of his life, is a series of outcomes that are extraordinary by any measure, and none of them were sought. The football scholarship arrived because someone saw him run. The military career arrived because the draft arrived. The shrimp company arrived because he promised his friend, and then kept the promise. The financial security arrived because someone else made a decision he didn't fully follow. The film is not arguing that life rewards the passive or that effort is unnecessary. Forrest works hard at everything he does, but it is suggesting something about the difference between striving and grasping, between full presence in the current moment and anxious management of the future. Forrest's extraordinary outcomes seem to arise precisely because he does not pursue them for their own sake. He pursues the task in front of him with complete attention, and the outcomes accumulate without his managing them. This is, at its heart, a kind of wisdom, one that most traditions of reflective thought have pointed toward in one form or another. The film's treatment of American history is one of its most distinctive and often discussed features. Forrest's life passes through the civil rights era, the assassination of Kennedy, the Vietnam War, the counterculture, and the social upheavals of the late 1960s, the Watergate scandal, the AIDS crisis in its early, unnamed years, and the emergence of the personal computer industry. He is present for all of these moments in ways that range from background observer to active participant, and his understanding of them is consistently literal rather than analytical. He shakes hands with presidents without grasping their significance. He is in Saigon without understanding geopolitics. He is on the National Mall during an anti-war rally without holding a coherent political position about the war. This narrative strategy creates a peculiar kind of comedy in places. The gap between Forrest's innocent account of events and the audience's knowledge of what those events meant is consistently humorous. But the film is also doing something more interesting with this device than simply generating gentle irony. It is presenting history as it is actually experienced by most people, which is to say, from very close range, without the context that only becomes available later. Most people who lived through the Kennedy assassination or the Vietnam War or Watergate did not experience those events with the full analytical frame that historians would later apply to them. They experienced them as weather, as things that were happening around them, changing the air, shifting the possibilities, felt before they were understood. Forrest's innocence makes him a kind of pure experiential witness to this weather. He is not distorted by ideology or ambition or historical self-consciousness. He simply reports what he saw and felt. And this simplicity makes room for the audience to bring their own understanding to the events without being directed toward a particular conclusion. The theme of friendship runs through the film as consistently as any other current, expressed primarily through Forrest's relationships with Bubba, with Lieutenant Dan, and ultimately with Jenny. Each of these relationships operates according to a different grammar, but each is characterized by a quality of genuine commitment on Forrest's part that doesn't waver or require maintenance. Bubba is loved from the first bus ride and honored for the rest of Forrest's life, long after he is gone. Dan is accepted without judgment and given space to become whoever he needs to become after Vietnam. Jenny is loved from the age of 6 on a school bus until the morning she dies, and beyond that. The film seems to suggest, without stating it directly, that this kind of love, patient, present, unconditioned, is both rare and transformative. Bubba died with the shrimp boat future still alive in his mind because Forrest confirmed it. Dan found his way back to himself, in part, because someone extended genuine welcome to someone who was not, in those years, particularly welcoming. Jenny was able to finally come home in part because home had been waiting for her with the same steady warmth it always had. The psychology of Forrest himself is built around qualities that are more usually discussed in philosophical or spiritual terms than in psychological ones. He is essentially free of what might be called temporal displacement, the human tendency to live mentally in the past through regret and in the future through anxiety, while missing the present entirely. Forrest is present. He remembers the past vividly and recounts it in detail, but he does not seem to be haunted by it in the way that shapes so much human suffering. He does not seem to anticipate the future with dread. He exists quite completely in the moment he is in, and this quality pervades every interaction he has and every task he undertakes. This is not presented as the result of limited intelligence, a misreading that the film gently deflects throughout. Forrest is perceptive about the feelings of the people around him. He notices when people are sad or frightened or in pain, and he responds to these states with a directness that is often more useful than more sophisticated responses. His understanding of human need is intuitive and generally accurate, even when his understanding of the political and historical context that surrounds those needs is minimal. He knows what matters to the people he loves without needing to analyze why it matters, and this knowing guides him well. Lieutenant Dan is perhaps Forrest's psychological opposite in the most instructive way. Dan is a man of considerable intelligence and genuine capability who is undone, at least temporarily, by his inability to accept the life he has rather than the life he had expected. His certainty that he was meant to die in war was not merely a belief. It was the organizing principle of his identity. When that organizing principle was removed by survival, he was left without a coherent story to live inside of, and the grief and rage that followed were proportionate to the loss. His years of drift and self-destruction are not merely biographical detail, but a portrait of what happens to a person when the frame of meaning is pulled away. The hurricane scene is the turning point of Dan's arc, and it is constructed as such with some care. His screaming at the storm is the final and most complete expression of his refusal to accept what has happened to him, directed now not at Forrest or at God in any specific theological sense, but at the storm itself, at randomness, at the indifferent power of nature that doesn't know or care that his plans were different. When the storm passes and he has survived again, something in him breaks open. The acceptance that follows is not joyful or triumphant. It is quiet and gradual, but it is real. By the time of Forrest's wedding, he has arrived at something that looks recognizable as peace. Jenny's psychology is the most complex and the most careful element of the film, and the one that rewards the most patient attention. She is a person who was harmed very early, in ways that left deep and lasting traces. The harm shaped her relationship to safety. She learned to associate danger with the familiar, and so the familiar became something to move away from. She was drawn across the years of her young adulthood toward things and people and situations that were exciting precisely because they were unstable. This is a pattern that anyone with some knowledge of trauma responses will recognize, and the film renders it without pathologizing it or reducing Jenny to a symbol of damage. She also had genuine gifts. Her desire for freedom was not simply flight. It was also a real orientation toward beauty and possibility. Her singing, her restlessness, her capacity to be moved by music and ideas, and the sense of something larger. These were qualities she was born with, not symptoms. The tragedy of her early life is not that it made her what she was, but that it made certain aspects of what she was harder to live with safely. She found her way back to herself and to Forrest, and to the son who waited in Savannah only after the urgency of the searching had exhausted itself. And even then, the illness was already in her. The film never makes Jenny responsible for her own suffering in the way that simpler narratives sometimes do. It presents her life as the result of things that were done to her before she had any power to shape her circumstances, combined with a nature that responded to those things in recognizable human ways, and played out across a historical moment that offered both remarkable freedoms and remarkable dangers. She is not punished by the narrative. She is accompanied through it with the same steady love that Forrest brings to everything, and she is laid to rest with gentleness and dignity under the tree she loved. Young Forrest, though present for only the final section of the film, carries significant thematic weight. He represents continuity, the continuation of something that has been built over decades through love and endurance, and the patient accumulation of presence. He has two parents in him, his mother's perceptiveness and his father's steadiness. He is bright and at ease and growing, which means that the story, at its end, has an open direction rather than a closed one. Life continues. The feather will drift somewhere new. The symbolism of the film is layered carefully throughout its runtime, and many of its most resonant images carry their meaning accumulations quietly rather than announcing them. The white feather that opens and closes the film is one of the most deliberately constructed images in the picture. Its journey through the air is governed by forces invisible to the viewer, by the particular temperature of the air at different heights, by the direction of the wind, by the interference of buildings and trees, and the warmth rising from pavement. The feather does not choose its path. It is not carried by intention. It goes where the forces around it take it, and it arrives eventually in exactly the place it needs to be. The film is careful to show us that this arriving is not random. The feather reaches Forrest at the bus stop, which is where the story begins, but it is also not control. It is something in between intention and accident, something that both of those words reach toward without quite containing. This is the film's central visual statement of its philosophy. The feather's journey mirrors Forrest's journey in the fundamental quality of its motion. Not driven, not aimless, but responsive. The feather is also strikingly light and resilient. It survives the whole length of its passage through the city air without being damaged or destroyed. It is preserved inside a book of stories, which is perhaps as close to a symbolic gesture as the film gets toward what stories themselves do. They preserve the things that might otherwise be lost. The box of chocolates is a symbol that has been so thoroughly absorbed into popular culture that it requires some deliberate attention to see it freshly. The wisdom it contains is genuinely interesting, partly because it is not a statement of despair. Mrs. Gump is not telling her son that life is random and therefore meaningless. She is telling him that life's unpredictability is not a problem to be solved, but a fact to be accepted and engaged with. The box of chocolates is something you reach into willingly. You don't have to reach in. The point is that you do reach in, knowing that you can't control what you get, and you receive what you receive, and you work with it, and you enjoy it if you can, and you keep going. This philosophy is demonstrated rather than argued throughout the film's runtime. Forrest reaches into situation after situation without knowing what he will find, and he always works with what he finds. The running that begins as an escape from bullies becomes the quality that earns him a scholarship. The military service that might have destroyed him produces the friendship with Bubba and the eventual partnership with Dan and the shrimp company that changes his material life. Even the grief of his mother's death produces the great running journey, which is itself a form of presence, of being fully in the body, covering the ground of the country, seeing and feeling and continuing. Running functions as one of the film's most flexible and resonant physical metaphors. Each time Forrest runs in the film, the running carries a different emotional and narrative content. The first running, away from the bullies on the dirt road, is survival. It is the discovery of a capacity he didn't know he had, revealed under pressure. The football running is purposeful and channeled, running within rules and toward defined objectives. The running in Vietnam is urgent and moral. He runs back toward danger rather than away from it, and this choice defines him as profoundly as anything else in the film. The running across America is grief expressed through the body, movement as a form of processing what stillness cannot hold. What all of these runnings share is a quality of completeness. When Forrest runs, he runs entirely. He does not hold anything back or calculate the cost. He runs until the thing that needed running is done. This is both his limitation, in the sense that it leaves him with no particular destination, and his greatest quality, in the sense that it means he never runs halfway. The tree in the Gump yard appears first in the context of Jenny's childhood. She climbed it to escape, to find a temporary elevation above the difficulties of her daily life. The tree is associated with both shelter and longing, with a desire to be somewhere other than where one is. The film returns to this tree at the end, when Jenny is buried beneath it, and the visual rhyme between the girl climbing toward the sky and the woman resting in the earth is not accidental. The tree that once offered temporary escape from life now offers permanent rest from it. This is a sad image and a gentle one at the same time, and the film holds both of those qualities without resolving them. The shrimping boat named Jenny is a form of portable love, a declaration of feeling made practical and physical. Forrest cannot always have Jenny near him, but he can name his boat after her and take her with him on the water every day. The boat weathers the hurricane that destroys the others, which the film presents without excessive explanation, allowing the possibility that the love in the naming offers its own protection, without insisting that this is the only reading. It is the most quietly magical moment in a film that otherwise adheres fairly closely to realistic cause and effect. The film's use of historical archive footage, placing Forrest into scenes with real presidents and other figures from the past, works both as visual comedy and as something more philosophically resonant. Each of these encounters illustrates the gap between proximity and understanding. The fact that being in the same room as history doesn't mean you understand what history is doing. But these scenes also suggest something about how history is always, for those living through it, a matter of individual encounters rather than grand narratives. Forrest meets Kennedy as a person shaking his hand, not as an icon. He meets Nixon as a man who seems pleasant. He participates in the cultural moments of his era the same way most people do, without the benefit of knowing what they will eventually come to mean. The film's structure, told retrospectively from a park bench, creates a particular relationship between the audience and the material. Everything has already happened by the time we hear about it. The man telling the story is alive and well, and dressed in a neat suit with chocolates in his lap. This retrospective frame does not remove the emotional weight of the sad events within the story, but it does change the quality of that weight. We know the story is survivable because the teller has survived it. We know there is a morning after every difficult night in this narrative, because Forrest is sitting in the morning on the bench, telling us about the nights. The strangers who sit beside Forrest on the bench and listen to his story are participants in a very old human activity, the receiving of narrative, the being told about someone else's experience, the sitting still while another person's life passes through the air between two people. Each stranger responds to Forrest's story differently. Some seem skeptical, some seem moved. Some have buses to catch and cannot stay for the whole thing. But each of them sits for a while, and while they sit, they are inside the story. This is, in miniature, what the film does with its audience. It sits us down, offers us something sweet, and begins. And so the story of Forrest Gump leaves us with a quiet reminder that a life need not be mapped in advance to arrive somewhere meaningful, that love expressed steadily and without condition is among the most powerful forces available to a human being, and that the things we carry with us, the feather saved between the pages of a book, the name painted on the side of a boat, the tree tended in a yard, are the ways we hold on to the people who made us who we are. Forrest ran across continents and sat with presidents and built businesses and raised a son and buried the person he loved most in the world. And through all of it, he remained fundamentally himself, present, patient, genuine, and entirely capable of being surprised by what the next moment might hold. The feather drifts back into the sky. Good night.